Introduction. And there's a little bit at the top, one of those bits. When you talk about films, nobody agrees with anybody. Guys get mad at each other, and the air is full of screaming. David Newman and Robert Benton. The movies will save themselves, 1968. Okay, this is the main text. A few dozen reporters, wire servicemen, studio publicity department employees, gossip columnists, and personal managers were gathered on Melrose Avenue in Hollywood, outside the locked headquarters of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. It was the morning of February the 20th, 1968. At 10 a.m., the doors opened, and the group was led inside and escorted to the Academy Library, where each person was handed an unsealed, oversized manila envelope containing the names of the 1967 Oscar nominees. The 5 films vying for Best Picture that year were Bonnie and Clyde, Dr. Dolittle, The Graduate, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and In the Heat of the Night. Some Academy Awards competitions offer an almost irresistible temptation to imagine that the Best Picture nominees represent a collective statement, a 5 snapshot collage of the American psyche as reflected in its popular culture. But that morning, all that was illuminated by the list of contenders was the movie industry's anxiety and bewilderment at a paroxysmal point in its own history. Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate were game changers. Movies that had originated far from Hollywood and had grown into critics' darlings and major popular phenomena. In the Heat of the Night, a drama about race, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a comedy about race, were middle-of-the-road hits that had, with varying degrees of success, extended a long tradition by addressing a significant social issue within the context of their chosen genres. And Dr. Dolittle was a universally dismissed children's musical that most observers felt had bought its way into the final 5. Of such mixed bags have countless Academy Awards races been made. That winter, the question of who was going to win had taken on more urgency than usual. Not who was going to win the Oscars, which would shortly be decided by the usual blend of caprice and conviction, but who was going to win ownership of the whole enterprise of contemporary movie making. The Best Picture lineup was more than diverse. It was almost self-contradictory. Half of the nominees seemed to be sneering at the other half. The Father Knows Best values of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner were wittily trashed by The Graduate. The hands joined in brotherhood, hopes expressed in the Heat of the Night, had little in common with the middle finger of insurrection extended by Bonnie and Clyde. What was an American film supposed to be? The men running the movie business used to have the answer. Now, it had slipped just beyond their reach, and they couldn't understand how they had lost sight of it. In the last year, the rule book seemed to have been tossed out. Warren Beatty, who looked like a movie star, had become a producer. Dustin Hoffman, who looked like a producer, had become a movie star. And Sidney Poitier, who looked like no other movie star had ever looked, had become the biggest box office attraction in an industry that still had no idea what to do with or about its popularity. The biggest hit among the 5 nominees, The Graduate, had been turned down by every major studio and financed independently. Bonnie and Clyde had been financed by Warner Brothers, but loathed by Jack Warner, who rued the day he put even a small amount of his company's money into it. In the Heat of the Night was made because United Artists ran the numbers and realized the film could be produced so cheaply that it would never have to play in the South at all and might still break even. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was greenlit only because Columbia Pictures owned its producer-director, Stanley Kramer, a movie. Together, in the four films cost about $10 million. The fifth picture, 20th Century Fox's Dr. Dolittle, cost more than twice as much to produce and promote as the other four combined. It was the only movie of the five that had been fueled by a studio's bottom line goal to manufacture an immense popular hit, and the only one that flopped. Dropped the book. Nearly dropped the book. Didn't drop it. I nearly dropped it. The Los Angeles Times looked at the list of nominees and called it a battle of the dragons against the dragonflies. The dragons were Stanley Kramer and Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy and Rex Harrison, the makers of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and Dr. Dolittle, and what the paper termed the armies of greybeard technicians who have been making movies their way since the dawn of the sound era. The dragonflies, nervous, rootless, hip, were Beatty and Hoffman, Faye Dunaway, Rod Steiger, Mike Nichols, Hal Ashby, Norman Jewison, and Arthur Penn, all newcomers, non-traditionalists or outsiders. The divide was generational, but also aesthetic. These were people who were rejecting what movies had been in favour of what they could be, and the fight was unabating. In Hollywood, by the time the 1967 Best Picture nominees were made public, it was increasingly clear that something was dying and something was being created. But the transition between old and new is never elegant or seamless. The dragons couldn't quite believe that they were running out of firepower, and the dragonflies, still excited to have buzzed their way across the moat and through the palace gates, would have been very surprised to hear that they were about to achieve a great deal more than that. As iconic as the images of Bonnie and Clyde in their dance of death, or Mrs. Robinson interposing herself between Benjamin and the bedroom door, or Sidney Poitier demolishing Rod Steiger with the line, "They call me Mr. Tibbs," became the second they reached the scene. They were still anomalies in a world that had just made The Sound of Music the highest grossing film in history. What paid studio bills in the mid-1960s were James Bond extravaganza, John Wayne westerns, Elvis Presley quickies, Dean Martin action comedies, and a long-standing willingness on the part of moviegoers to suspend disbelief. Now suddenly, people also wanted Blow Up and The Dirty Dozen, and Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name, and Bob Dylan in Don't Look Back, a title that could have served as a rallying cry for a generation of moviegoers that had emerged faster and more forcefully than the studios could have imagined. The old and the new existed in uneasy proximity, eyeing each other across a red-carpeted aisle that was becoming easy to mistake for a battle line. A fight that began as a contest for a few small patches of Hollywood turf ended as the first shot in a revolution. All movies are gambles. Each one begins with a prayer that what seems like a brilliant idea to its writers and directors and producers and actors, all the moment it is kindled, will still have meaning after years of fights and compromises and reconceptions and struggles when it comes alive on the screen. The 5 movies up for Best Picture did have one thing in common. They had all been imagined for the first time many years earlier in a world that bore little resemblance to the one in which they arrived in 1967. This is the story of what happened to those movies, to the hopes and ambitions of their creators, and to American filmmaking in the 5 years between their conception and their birth. I'm going to fast forward quite a long way. You see my bookmarks? See where I put them? Fast forward to page 181. On June the 1st, 1968, 19, it's not very well printed, 1966. On June the 1st, 1966, Jack Valenti, a 44-year-old former Texas advertising executive who had become a special assistant to Lyndon B. Johnson, left his White House post to head the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA. Had left the White House post, his White House post, to head the Motion Picture Association of America. The MPAA had had only 2 presidents since its founding in 1922. Will Hayes, the architect of the 1930s production code that still governed the content of Hollywood movies, and Eric Johnson, whose death in 1963 had left the organization rudderless for almost 3 years. The MPAA had many functions, the most economically significant of which was to operate as the movie industry's lobbying arm in Washington. But at the moment Valenti took over, the association was consumed by the issue of censorship, and in particular by its oversight of the failing and outminded production code. While Code Administrator Jeffrey Sherlock was still systematically ticking off the number of uses of hell and damn in every script, and informing producers by letter what lines, scenes, and even gestures would have to come out of their screenplays, American filmmakers were rising in insurrection, not only against the code's restrictions, but against its very existence. As Valenti began work, the crisis over the code was coming to a head so quickly that there was little time for deliberation. For decades. Control over the content of Hollywood films had been split 3 ways in an unofficial power-sharing arrangement between the studios themselves via the code, religious organizations such as the National Catholic Office for Motion Pictures and the Episcopal Committee for Motion Pictures, and censorship boards whose standards varied capriciously by city and state and which were generally overseen by local police departments. As a result, films with potentially inflammatory subjects would sometimes end up playing in a checkerboard pattern across the country. For instance, it took 2 years and a fight that went to the Georgia Supreme Court before the Oscar-winning Room at the Top about an extramarital affair could be shown in Atlanta. The system was intended to encourage self-censorship by the studios. The more stringently they governed by their own product, the less risk they would run of a religious anti-Hollywood groundswell or of having to fight costly legal battles to get the movie shown. Until the last few years, that had given Sherlock near absolute power, no matter how many decades behind the times some of the production code's statutes were. In 1961, when he had reviewed the script for West Side Story and ruled that the words schmuck and SOB, and even a phrase as mild as he's hot, would have to be deleted from Stephen Sondheim's lyrics, UA, United Artists, had no choice but to comply. Even as late as 1964, the code was able to veto the movie titled How to Murder Your Mistress, in favour of the somehow more acceptable How to Murder Your Wife. Okay. But the code's rigidity had recently begun to work against it. The influx of European films, some with nudity that weren't produced by studios and didn't require a code seal, had created a double standard. Local theatres, meeting the demands of their audiences, were increasingly willing to show movies without code approval, as well as those that had been branded with the Catholic rating of condemned. The double standard didn't apply only to sex. Dated and rarely enforced code provisions against things like trick methods shown for concealing guns, illegal abduction, and the depiction of any notorious real-life criminal who had not been punished for his crimes, had turned Hollywood's rulebook into a bizarre patchwork of policies, some rigorously enforced and others routinely ignored. Distributors were challenging local censorship boards in courts across the country, and almost always winning, while conservative and religious organizations were calling for the code to be abolished altogether and replaced by film ratings, an idea that the studios resisted, believing it was the first step towards outright censorship. The studios had reason to distrust the motives, of those who were calling for a classification system. The only ratings for films at the time were handed out under the aegis of the National Catholic Office for Motion Pictures, which classified movies on a scale based not on age appropriateness, but on degree of moral turpitude, up to and including condemnation. The National Catholic Office was blunt about its desire for a rating system that would keep movies with adult subject matter out of many theatres altogether. Valenti knew the code was preposterous, but he worried that the rating system might bring even bigger problems. He correctly surmised that film ratings will result in more freedom rather than less, since once a movie could be designated as being for adults, it could offer unapologetically adult content. That, he feared, would lead to more clashes with municipal censorship boards or a fight against church leaders that Hollywood was desperate to avoid. But he knew that in its present form, the code was doomed. The 1965 decision to approve the nudity in The Pawnbroker because of the film's high quality had created an untenable loophole, suggesting that one standard existed for good films and another for ordinary ones. Although the studios had always cooperated with Sherlock, they had no interest in allowing him to judge their movies on merit. Valenti and Louis Nizza, who had signed a 5-year contract to serve as the MPAA's senior counsel, hadn't even unpacked their boxes when Jack Warner decided to use Mike Nichols, who was afraid of Virginia Woolf, to finish what The Pawnbroker had started. Although the first time they saw the picture, Warner and his executives had famously reacted by saying, "My God, we've got a £7.5 million dirty movie on our hands." Nichols had jockeyed skillfully behind the scenes to keep much of its profanity intact. The vast circle of New York friends he had acquired in the years since he had starred with Elaine May on Broadway proved to be a critical asset. Virginia Woolf won a perfectly choreographed private endorsement from Jacqueline Kennedy, who, at Nichols' request, attended a small screening and made sure to stay within earshot of a key member of the Catholic Film Board. Jack would have loved this movie. After extensive internal debate, the National Catholic Office gave Virginia Woolf a rating of A4, morally unobjectionable for adults with reservations. This coup, which allowed the film to escape not only a C, condemned, rating, but a B, morally objectionable, in part for all. would put even more pressure on the production code authority to approve the film. Jack Warner then came up with his own preemptive way of undercutting the code. On May 25th, 1966, he announced that Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf would be released with the label for adults only, and that theatres would have to sign contracts agreeing not to admit minors without adult accompaniment. While newspaper ads for independent or foreign movies had carried adults-only labels for years, the label was used as a racy tease, not as a studio enforceable restriction. Warner's maneuver, which effectively created the R rating 2 years before a rating system existed, unsettled Jeffrey Sherlock. Sherlock was now 71 and had enjoyed extraordinary influence over the years. At one point, he was even able to order Alfred Hitchcock to reshoot the opening scene of Psycho. But his investment in the code was rooted more in a desire to protect his own power than in any innate prudishness. When Warner Brothers bought Virginia Woolf, Sherlock had warned them that there was unacceptable language on 83 pages of the script. But after Warner's decision, Sherlock knew his own standing was at stake and decided not to risk a public defeat. For the first time ever, he declined to make any ruling and privately advised Jack Warner to end-run him and take Virginia Woolf straight to the Code's appeal board. That jury, led by Valenti, who had spent just 10 days in his new job, approved the movie using the same pretext they had offered for The Pawnbroker, announcing that they would not have given the seal to a film of lesser quality, and warning that this exemption does not mean that the floodgates are open. But of course, it meant exactly that. Valenti had already stated that he had serious questions about the entire philosophy of self-censorship, and in his first week running the MPAA, he ordered the complete overhaul of the production code, which he said Sherlock would continue to administer. Sherlock quickly announced that he thought Virginia Woolf was marvellous and had simply been following the rules by withholding a seal. The Virginia Woolf experience and Valenti was Fort Sumter. It revealed to me that the past was done. I was quite sure what the future was going to be. But he was sure of one thing. After a heated hour-long private meeting in which he, Nizer, Jack Warner, and Warner's New York distribution chief, Ben Kalmenson, had dickered over every single profanity in the movie before it even went to the appeals board, he said to Nizer, "I'm not going through that again. I'm not going to spend my life sitting in offices and saying, I've got to take out one shit and one screw. This is crazy." If Warner had any worries that the controversy over Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf would endanger its profitability, they were quickly allayed. The trade paper Variety, which used to headline its major reviews with a prognostication about the film's box office, simply and accurately wrote of its prospect, big. They weren't wrong. Virginia Woolf became the second highest grossing film of 1966, trailing only Thunderball, as the lure of seeing Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton behind closed doors doing something suitable for adults only proved irresistible. Reviews were stellar, with many critics pointedly endorsing Warner's use of a warning label and to applauding the license it would give Hollywood filmmakers to tackle rougher material. Nichols was once again the man of the moment, but not an especially happy one. Jack Warner had treated him badly during post-production of Virginia Woolf. Nichols had wanted the film's composer, Alex North, replaced with Andre Previn. When he pushed too hard, Warner bristled and had him barred from the editing room with only a day or two of work left. North's score stayed in, but Nichols had won almost every other battle. Still, his first Hollywood movie had left him battered and exhausted, and he found the overwhelming praise for his movie debut disorienting. I am upset by good reviews. I get the feeling very unreal and very undeserving, he told the Today Show. Nichols was now becoming as famous as many of the people he directed, and too busy for his own comfort. Production of The Graduate was supposed to start in the fall. He had just signed to direct the movie version of Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which was to start shooting the following summer. And with the first 3 Broadway plays he directed all running, he had also agreed to stage his first Broadway musical, a trio of one acts by composer and lyricist of Fiddler on the Roof, called Come Back, Go Away, I Love You, later retitled The Apple Tree. In early 1966, ABC decided to make him the focus of an hour-long special, The Many Worlds of Mike Nichols. They turned out to be too many worlds. Nichols decided to retreat. He cancelled the special, pushed Catch-22 further into the future, and postponed production of The Graduate until spring of 1967. Now we're going to jump through to the epilogue. We've missed all that. Having already missed all that. Do you want to read it quickly? Epilogue. Page 418. At the end of 1968, Variety printed its annual list of the highest grossing movies of all time. 1/3 of the top 20 had opened in 1967. Highest of all was The Graduate, which eventually became the 3rd most successful movie in history, surpassed only by The Sound of Music and Gone with the Wind. The movie ran in theatres for almost 2 years. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner became the 11th highest grossing movie ever. Valley of the Dolls and The Dirty Dozen finished 16th and 17th. And To Sir with Love was in a 19th place tie with Bonnie and Clyde, which grossed more than 6 times as much in 1968 as it had in 1967, even surpassing the James Bond film You Only Live Twice. In the Heat of the Night was re-released after its Best Picture win and finished its initial run with a solid worldwide gross of about $16 million, 5 times its production and marketing budget. Dr. Dolittle returned just $3.5 million in rentals to 20th Century Fox, less than 15% of its production and marketing costs. The success of the pictures in the class of 1967 focused Hollywood's attention on a new generation of movie makers and moviegoers, and heralded what is now seen as a second golden age of studio movie making that lasted roughly until the late 1970s, when audience tastes and demographics changed once again, and the dawn of the summer blockbuster era generated a durable new economic model for the movie business. But old Hollywood, the Hollywood of producer, and the studio-driven product intended to reach the widest possible audience, didn't disappear. It simply reinvented itself. Even at the height of the new Hollywood revolution, what Altman and Coppola and Mazursky and Scorsese and Friedkin and Schlesinger were dominating was conversation. The studios were beginning to find a way of creating and selling their product that didn't depend so much on directors. In 1970, Universal the Last Choice Studio, for much of the previous decade, released Airport, the first movie in what was soon to become known as the disaster genre. It quickly became the most popular movie since The Graduate. Many of the films that followed it, The Poseidon Adventure, Towering Inferno, The Swan, were written by Sterling Siliphant, who died in 1996 at the age of 78. I'm going to cut another big bit out. Okay, right to page 425 and a bit of page 426, the end of the book. Only after the 1968 Academy Awards, Sidney Poitier was named the biggest box office star in America in the national poll of theatre owners, the first time a black actor had ever held the top spot. He was, he told an interviewee, totally free, owned by no man or woman. It didn't matter, as Poitier himself had predicted, his days as a movie star were over. In the face of increasingly brutal and public attacks, even George Wallace would like that nigger, said H. Rap Brown after seeing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Poitier retreated by degrees from the very public life he had led. He gave fewer interviews and spent less time in the United States, and while he continued to make movies for several more years, including two in which he reprised the role of Virgil Tibbs, before a 12-year retirement from screen acting that began in 1977. None of them had the cultural or popular impact of the three films he made in 1967. Poitier rarely spoke in detail of the pain he felt of being jeered at as a symbol of accommodation to white Americans. Stanley Kramer urged him to keep working, to try not to think about the insults, to stay focused. As ever, Poitier kept his own counsel. A couple of years after their rift, he and Harry Belafonte repaired their friendship. In 1972, Poitier stepped behind the camera for the first time to direct Belafonte in Buck and The Preacher. He went on to direct 8 more movies. In 1967, shortly before the release of In the Heat of the Night, Poitier told a reporter that he had always tried to make a positive contribution to the image of Negro people in America with the roles he had chosen. I guess I was born out of joint with the miners, he said. I guess I was born out of joint with the Times, he said. I have not made my peace with the Times. They are still out of kilter, but I have made my peace with myself.